Hi, guys. This is Caroline Constas, and I'm looking forward to kicking off our newly launched philanthropic initiative, the Persephone Project, with our very first talk series. I also wanted to mention that it is May 1st today, so we have officially entered Mental Health Awareness Month, and I thought that there was no better way to kick off the series other than starting a dialogue around food, being that food is what fuels our minds and bodies. So that being said, we are here today with Rebecca Appleman, registered dietitian and founder of Appleman Nutrition, to discuss issues surrounding food that we may be facing in isolation due to social distancing. So welcome, Rebecca.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you.
Great. Yeah, we're really excited that you're here too. I guess what led me to want to discuss this is that I myself find my habits around food to be seriously influenced by stress and the unknown. And as we all know, there are a lot of stressors and a lot of uncertainty right now, causing a lot of confusion and in general, just a feeling, I think we're all experiencing a feeling of loss of control. And I think that these are moments where we might see the stress acting out now in how we consume food. And then, of course, there are all these issues of like these fad driven diets, the quarantine diet, for example, and just a lot of different theories on what healthy eating actually is. So I thought it could be helpful to break down some of the myths and realities as to what healthy eating really looks like. So, Rebecca, with all that said, I will let you take it from there.
That sounds great. I mean, I think that you're asking a really critical question. I think that what I'm hearing regularly, day in and day out in my office or my virtual office now, is that this expression of not only confusion and frustration, but fear in how do I really fuel myself well, not only during this period of quarantine, but there's been a real reflection on daily habits as they've been established over time. And people are really asking themselves again, how can I nourish myself in the way that is going to achieve the best in health? And there really is so much information out there that's confusing. And what I try to lead people to do is to really redefine for themselves what healthy is personally, because that answer is really going to be quite personal and quite individual. As I said, the sentiment that I hear most often in my office is, I just want to be healthy. But then what I often hear is this sort of list of food rules that people feel they often need to adhere to in order to achieve health. And it ends up feeling very, very stressful or really unmanageable or unattainable. And right now, what we're seeing during the quarantine is that for those people who felt they needed to adhere to a specific plan or set of food rules prior to quarantine, that the pressure to do so now feels even more intense and overwhelming because, as you mentioned, there's this vast amount of time that's unstructured that a lot of us are unused to. And naturally, it's much harder to keep a schedule with food or anything else, really. So I think one of the main things that we need to do in defining what is healthy eating, especially right now, but really always, is to allow for flexibility and not expect perfection with food. That really healthy eating is actually sort of perfectly imperfect, as I sort of state often in my office.
That's great. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think of that way, that people who live really long lives lead lifestyles with food that are moderate and that are expansive, right? Because also what happens is when you expect such perfection with food, you ultimately, nobody can stick to that type of rigid structure. And so then you're left with feelings of guilt for not following through. And oftentimes what I see in my practice is people end up rebelling with food and eating in a way that then feels awful, not only physically and physiologically, but emotionally. So as we're redefining what's healthy, we want to feel empowered by the fact that this is going to be specific to who we are. And we want to look at, well, what's my personal history? What's my history been like with food and with my relationship with food and how food functioned in my family of origin when I was growing up? What flavors and cuisines were presented to me as I as I started to really become, a real expansive eater. And what is my living situation? What's my professional lifestyle like? All of that information needs to be taken into account to determine what healthy eating is. Then that's at any moment in time, not just during quarantine. So I think people really need to feel very empowered to look at, what does healthy eating mean for me? And later on in our conversation, we're going to really guide them with the questions that they should ask themselves.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I think that would be super helpful. And just to go back to all these fads and diets, like it almost seems like every day there's a new golden product or diet that everyone is rushing to consume or following super intensely. And then we later find out that this product or this diet is actually not as healthy as we thought. And then there are obviously these misconceptions of some foods being evil or off limits. And I just think it would be really helpful to maybe break down some of the myths versus the realities around some foods, like carbs and fats and so on. So if you wanted to maybe give us some insight around that.
Thanks, Caroline. I think that that's really smart, because I think you're validating a lot of the frustrations that people feel day in and day out with how to feed themselves. And I think one thing that's important to remember just at this particular moment is that your physiology and your metabolic needs haven't really changed so much just because we're fighting a pandemic. So adopting a new diet right now, probably not the healthiest choice. But let's get into some of the popular myths that people need clarification on. First is that people sometimes believe that fat is the enemy. And that's a dangerous sort of thought, because fats really contribute to brain health, heart health, and bone health. They decrease inflammation in the body, which is cardioprotective. And those are specifically the unsaturated fats and the monounsaturated fats in particular. And they also lend flavor to food and texture, and thereby they enhance satiety. So you'll end up very likely, by including these high quality fats, eating less overall, which is also important for weight maintenance. In terms of carbohydrate, oftentimes people think that carbs are evil, and that's really not the case at all. And also sort of dangerous. By eliminating carbohydrate, you're going to notice a massive increase in irritability and also distractibility. Your brain is an obligate carbohydrate user and requires that for optimal functioning. Also, in terms of regulating your GI tract and also cultivating a healthy microbiome, carbohydrate is critical. And then lastly, carbs are really important for mood stabilization. And that relates to amino acids such as tryptophan and the neurotransmitter serotonin.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It is interesting. And in fact, actually, oftentimes I recommend a night snack that is carbohydrate containing, because it also helps with a healthy sleep cycle. So people who are having trouble sleeping, falling asleep, or staying asleep might want to try a night snack that introduces a little bit of carbohydrate with a tiny bit of protein. In terms of clean eating, I oftentimes hear a lot of discussions around clean eating and raw foods, et cetera. I think that this is something that people need to look at carefully, because this very high volume, low density style of eating oftentimes puts a lot of stress on the body. It is exceptionally high in volume, just in terms of bulk and also in terms of fiber. And that could cause a lot of GI distress, a lot of bloating, a lot of distension. And it also ends up leaving people with this artificial sense of how to feel full, and can actually prime them to binge eat, in addition to just being sort of an unsatisfying way to eat, because it's very low fat. And sometimes, depending on which plan you're adhering to, can be low in protein too.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. This is extremely helpful. You had actually earlier mentioned that healthy eating is custom to each individual, which I found really interesting. Are there maybe some questions that we can ask ourselves to help guide us to eat in a way that accompanies our lifestyles best?
Exactly, Caroline. I think that what we do in our office is encourage people to define healthy eating for who they are, for what they like to eat, and for what foods feel truly satisfying to them. So there's a few key questions that you can ask yourself in trying to determine what the best eating style is for you. Are you choosing foods that you truly enjoy and that contribute to satiety? Are you choosing foods that are balanced and meals that are balanced, so that they include carbohydrate and protein and fat and some kind of a fruit or vegetable at most meals? So not eliminating those key components that we talked about earlier when we were talking about myths. Am I allowing myself to have snacks and include 2 food groups in those snacks? And that could look like, crackers and cheese. It could look like a sweet potato with a dollop of sour cream. It could be any host of things, whatever feels like it meets your food impulse.
Like, can it be a cookie with milk?
That's a perfect example. A cookie with milk, a croissant with a cup of coffee. Sweet fat combination foods, typically carbohydrate and fat, still contribute to nutrients. They will not have as much lasting power as, let's say like whole fat yogurt with, granola. It's a different type of snack, but it is a absolutely delicious snack and one that is satisfying and totally healthy. Eating consistently throughout the day is very important. And most importantly is the intention that you go into your meals with. So are you focusing on what you want to include rather than what you think you should be avoiding? I find that point is one that tends to trip people up the most, because if all you are thinking about is what you cannot have, it is going to be very difficult to feed yourself well.
So like, for example, if I'm craving cacio e pepe one day, I should just go for it and have that.
Without the shadow of a doubt. I'll give you another example. I had yesterday when in between my sessions, I made myself a sandwich for a snack. The sandwich had avocado and cheese and whole egg on a big hunk of whole wheat bread. And that had a lot of staying power. Many people might have that as a meal for breakfast, but I really needed more during my snack time, and that felt right. And in the morning, I had something sweeter, actually. I had a muffin with coffee with half and half and sugar. Perfectly healthy and balanced.
So really listening to your internal cues and what you're really craving.
That's exactly right. So what you want to do is see if you can determine what your food impulse is, which is, what do I want to eat, and follow through with it. And the chances are, if you are able to follow through with it and actually eat in a mindful way, you will really not think about food for quite some time after that. So really, healthy eating becomes super enjoyable once you broaden the definition of what is healthy and make it expansive, and then realize that it's not just about nutrient content, it's about your experience of what you are eating and how satisfying it is.
Well, this was great, and I think really helpful for a lot of people. I know it was definitely informative and interesting and eye-opening for me. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us today.
I had so much fun with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much. And guys, we hope that you stay tuned for our next talk series.
See you soon.